Thanks, guys. Hello, today I want to talk to you about brand activism. Not whether it's good or bad, but if and how it works. One theory is that we have the internet to thank for brand activism. When you think about the places we spend our time online, most of them were built around brands, and it's made them more prominent in our lives. And with great power comes great responsibility. In this case, the responsibility for brands to act as moral arbiters. Another theory pins the blame on failing governments, partly because brands are having to step in and perform their civic duty, but also because divisive politics has turned everyone into activists, and brands hate to sit out a trend. Whatever the reason, brand activism is becoming more common, and as Patagonia demonstrated this earlier this year, more intense. So does this mean that political opinions are now just a part of branding? Well, the UK public aren't too thrilled by the idea, but Nike co-founder Phil Knight seems to think so. Speaking about his brand's Colin Kaepernick, he said, "It doesn't matter how many people hate your brand, as long as enough people love it. You can't be afraid of offending people," he added. "You have to take a stand on something." And yet, a lot of marketers are still afraid. In her annual CMO survey, Professor Christine Moorman asked marketers whether they think it's appropriate for their brand to take a stand on politically charged issues. And in January this year, only 18.5% said yes. And marketers are right to be cautious. Brand activism is different from CSR and from purpose. It means taking a partisan position on a socio-political issue on which there is no moral consensus. And its effects are not well understood. So to try and fill that gap, we looked at the research to see if we could find some basic principles about how brand activism works. And we could. So here they are, the 3 A's of brand activism. The first is asymmetry, which takes a little bit of explaining. So it's pretty well established that people prefer to buy brands that reflect their identity, or at least their desired identity. It's probably not the first thing people think about when they're buying something, but research has repeatedly shown that strong consumer brand identification tends to improve attitudes and purchase intent, all that good stuff. The flip side is that people are also, again to some degree, repelled by brands that clash with their identity. And thanks to some primal thought process that was probably very useful thousands of years ago, it's a lot easier to trigger those negative reactions than it is to build positive ones. That's why people are much more likely to boycott a brand that has done wrong than to actively support one that's done an equivalent amount of good. And in a study published in March, Sergio Mukherjee and Nikal Thweezen found that this same uneven response applied to brand activism in quite an extreme way. They tested whether people's attitudes towards brands changed when they learned their stance on things like immigration and abortion. They found that when people agree with a brand stance, nothing much happens, apparently because people already expect brands to have the same values as them. But when brands took a stance people didn't like, they got punished. In one experiment, not only did the participants say they liked the offending brands less, they refused freebies from them and even turned down cash to post stories about them on social media. The researchers called this an asymmetric effect. And the only thing that changed this asymmetric effect was a backlash. When brands came under attack for taking a stand, their supporters tended to rally behind them a little bit. I think Goya Foods is a good example of this. The brand became the target of a boycott in July after its CEO praised Donald Trump. But a few months later, it was claiming its sales had jumped. Partly, it said, because supporters wanted to show their solidarity by buying the brand more. But while Mukherjee and Thweezen's finding on brand activism seem generally pretty grim, some more research paints a slightly brighter picture. Chris Hydock and his team looked at how brand activism affects customer choice. And unlike the previous study, they found that there were some benefits to brand activism. In the experiments, a significant number of participants did prefer to choose brands whose values align with their own. And in some cases, they were even willing to sacrifice price and product quality to make a choice that fit with their identity. But Hydock and his team still found what they called a negativity bias, which means that at a group level, people were more likely to stop choosing a brand they disagreed with than switch to a brand whose values they liked. Based on this negativity bias, Hydock figured out that successful brand activism came down to market share. Small brands are more likely to benefit because the pool of potential customers they'll win is so much larger than the pool of existing customers they'll lose. And that's purely a function of having relatively few customers to lose in the first place. And this means that with a small enough market share, almost any stance is a good idea. In one experiment, a brand took a pro-Brexit stance and increased the number of people who chose it from 5 to 16%. And that was despite the fact that almost 3/4 of the group were against Brexit. But one thing to remember is that these are lab experiments. They can't take everything into account. For instance, they don't consider that large brand may attract like-minded customers. And they only look at the effects of one-off brand activist statements, not years of consistent messaging. But both studies agree that brand activism works by strengthening or weakening consumer brand identification. And both say it's a lot easier to do one than it is the other. Which brings us to our next A, alignment. Yashoda Bhagwat and her team looked at what happened to the share price and sales of companies that engaged in brand activism. They looked at almost 300 real-world examples, and they found that most of the time, these companies' stock prices fell. Investors were wary of brand activism, especially when it threatened to take resources and attention away from profit-making. Bit of a one-track mind, those investors. But Bhagwat also found some interesting variables. For instance, when brands joined forces to advocate an issue, or when they linked the cause to their own self-interest, things weren't so bad. And when a female CEO announced the brand activism, investors tended to respond better, as they did when a CMO, not the CEO, did the talking. But the game changer was the discovery that investors weren't wary of brand activism per se. They were just wary of upsetting their stakeholders. When investors think that a stance will align with what customers and employees want, they'll get behind it too. Which it turns out is a pretty good bet, because the research showed that well-aligned activism boosted not just the stock price, but also sales, while misaligned activism lowered both stock price and sales too. Now, there's no small amount of irony here. Brand activism, by definition, means addressing divisive issues. So finding alignment is not an easy thing to do. But as far as we can tell, there's no way around it either. But while alignment is necessary for successful brand activism, it's not sufficient. You need something else. Which brings us to our final principle, authenticity. It was bound to show up. Hydock found that a lack of authenticity obliterates the positive effects of brand activism, but it leaves the negative ones intact. So it not only fails to impress people who would agree with the stance, it still pisses off those who disagree. And by the way, authenticity here just means genuineness. What it shouldn't be confused with is brand fit. Brand fit means talking about issues that are somehow related to your brand, or which people think your brand has the authority to discuss. And Bhagwat and her team was surprised to see in their analysis that a lack of brand fit didn't really make a difference. In fact, one piece of theoretical research argues that in some cases, a lack of brand fit might actually be a good thing. In her paper, Jessica Vredenberg argues for what she calls optimal incongruence, which basically means just the right amount of unexpectedness. I think Ben & Jerry's Dismantle White Supremacy post was a good example of this. But then so is Burger King. Its campaigns against bullying and net neutrality were completely unexpected, and people really paid attention because of it. Vredenberg says that incongruence works because it makes people stop and think harder, resulting in potentially more intense reactions. But it only works up to a point. If you go too weird with it, people will be turned off. More than that, incongruence doesn't work when the stance clashes with a customer's own values. Once again, it's all about alignment. The final thing to say about brand activism, which didn't really fit into my 3A structure, is about the causes themselves. Now, there's not a lot of research about how brand activism benefits the causes being championed, but thanks to Andrew Edelblum, there is at least some. Edelblum hasn't even published this study yet, but I spent a lot of time this year looking for new evidence of how brand activism works, and I spotted a passing reference to a talk he gave, and then managed to track him down for a chat. None of that helps you understand brand activism, of course. I just enjoy telling people how hard I work. So Edelblum and his team showed people social media posts about a divisive cause. And these posts came from either a brand or from the organisation representing the cause itself. So, one group might see a post from Adidas urging people to support Planned Parenthood, and another would see a post from Planned Parenthood itself. The participants were then asked how they'd divide a $10 reward between themselves and the cause. This experiment was replicated 8 times with almost 2,000 participants, and in every experiment the same thing happened. People who saw a post from a brand they identified with gave 30% more than those who saw messages from the cause itself. Meanwhile, the people who said they didn't identify with the brand in the post, they gave around 30% less. And Edelman says this shows brands can exert moral cues on people. But in the experiments, the moral cues only worked for causes that people already supported. If someone is anti-abortion, they're not going to fund Planned Parenthood just because their favourite tracksuit brand told them to. And this is the crux of it. Almost all the research I've come across indicates the same thing. Brand activism is a weak persuasive force. But that doesn't mean it's useless. If you understand the principles of how brand activism works, you can still harness it to good effect. There may be no evidence so far to suggest that brands have the power to change people's minds about an issue, but there's plenty to show that they can make issues and people's own thoughts about those issues more salient. And as anyone who builds brands for a living should know, that can be a pretty powerful thing by itself. Thanks very much.